students, welcome to this paper on distributed application development. Fine. This paper has been divided into several modules. Fine. We have around 36 modules. Fine. So, fine. These modules, yes, what is this paper on distributed application development all about? Fine. So, this is just this module is going to talk about. In this module, I will be talking about the introduction of the paper. Fine. What are the various modules which we have, and what is this? There is one this entire, because this is distributed application development, it is all going to be based on a client server paradigm. So, I will also talk about what is this client server paradigm. Fine. Our understanding, fine, from the general point of view, fine, what do we understand as a client server paradigm? Okay, what is this distributed application development? Fine. Oh, it is about what? When someone says distributed application development, fine, it is about actually applications whose components, fine, have been divided into several parts. Some parts, fine, rather than having entire responsibility of the entire thing, all the facilities available in a particular application being available in one single place as a single executable or something, fine. Rather than having one heavy weight such thing, we would have our application developed in divided into several tiers. We have the concept of n tiers. So, we have the applications being divided into n tiers, and yes, what is the role of each and every tier, how they interact, how the various things would perform, and what are the various components, how they sit in a particular. So, we have a distributed thing, and one of the most commonly used, one of the most common ways of distributing applications now is as far as the interface. There is one aspect which is of the interface. So, as far as the interfacing is concerned, the interface would normally be a web interface. So, in this particular paper, we have many of the modules, or rather most of the modules are actually concentrating on that web interface. And what we have chosen is, we have chosen the Java technology. Fine. There are various other technologies also available, but for this paper we have chosen to use Java technology. So, it is not the only way, fine, there are other mechanisms, but yes, to just explain and get through everything working, fine, Java is one of the most common technology which is openly available and very commonly used and more popular. So, for that reason we have actually chosen to use the Java technology for all our various modules. Fine. So, most of the places you will find Java technology being used. Okay. But fine, you can understand when it is distributed application development, it is not just one particular technology which can be used, other options are available, fine, equivalent options are there. Okay. So, let us try to first understand what do we understand by a client server paradigm. What is a client? What is a client and a server? What is this understanding about client and server? So, if you look at even the real world also, what is a server or what is a client? From the real world, if you have to pick it up, fine, anything, any kind of a service being provided by someone, he is a server, he gives me some service, and we have clients who utilize the service. So, anything, fine, which fine, any kind of a service being provided. In real world we have so many services, yes, anyone giving any service, and a person who makes use of the service is the client. Fine. One important thing which we always have in this is, yes, there is going to be communication involved in all this, there is going to be communication between two separate components, fine, but here you can see one of the component, the one who is giving service is just the kind of a person who just has to wait and listen, and he is not the initiator of the communication. The initiator of the communication is always going to be a client. The client is the one who has to be initiating a communication. So, whatever it may be, fine. So, yes, fine. So, from that point of view, right. So, you can say fine it is not only we find this client server paradigm only from the point of view of a particular thing. See, anything which you develop, fine, you can see this paradigm even if let us say someone has developed a Java class, fine, which is very general. The methods which are there in the Java class are used by someone, right, and that is being used by some other developer, fine. That particular application which makes use of that method, invokes a method, or even that is a client server. The one, there is someone who initiates and invokes a method, right. He is the one who is initiating, invoking a method, and this component here is having that method, he is providing a service. Okay, but one thing here, this all happens within a thread. No, not that way. So, but yes, you could, if this is something which is separated out, done by two separate threads, fine, it would be more like a client server. So, client server, yes, one is even method invocations are like this, fine. Client server, browser is a client interacting with some web server, right. So, you find lot of such instances. You can even have, if you know networking. So, we will the kind of let us also have a overview of what all modules we are having, the flow, the kind of flow which we have over all these modules, fine. So, what we have done in this particular paper here is we have initially started with the module called module on networking. So, what was networking? The networking is mainly about how to have communication between two processes which are on two different hosts. We do have we have got inter-process communication which happens within the same machine. Even that is also a client server paradigm, you can say, because there is someone who is making a service available, fine. There is someone who makes a service available, and then there is a interaction which is done by another component. So, component to component interaction, the interaction initiated by someone, that is a client. The one with whom the interaction is actually taking place, that is a server. I have to interact with someone to get some information, to get something. So, that is the other person is the service provider, he is the server, and I am the client if I am asking for something. Right. So, it is a very simple paradigm, basically client server, okay, anyone giving service, any kind of a service, but yes, we have process to process now, it is about processes. So, one would be inter-process communication which happens within the same machine, but we have this is to be over any kind of a host. You have one particular host having a particular process running, and we have another host from where we have a application which would like to interact with that particular other process, interact with that process, give some request, give a response, and have some interaction initiated. So, even that is also clients, that is what we have actually, that is something which we would do in our initial module, our second module actually on networking, fine. So, the second module which is about networking. So, there what you will be learning is about the core basic raw TCP IP based connection, fine, how to create a TCP IP based connection, how two processes can interact over a TCP IP based connection, and it would help you to even write some kind of a server. Our more concentration in all these modules is about actually writing more on server side, fine. There are a few things which are also for the client side, but yes. So, first module 2 is basically on networking. So, networking here we are using Java networking, there is a java.net package, socket, server socket, those are the basic classes. So, we will talk about those in the module 2. Module 3 is about multi-threading. When a server is written, the server giving it giving some kind of a service, but no, it will not be giving service to one client at a time. So, if you have written some kind of a server process, in module 2 we develop something called a eco server. So, in module 3 what we do is we will make that eco server such that even if there are multiple clients working asking for service simultaneously, it should still be able to give service to all of them. So, what we need here on the server side is we need multi-threading. So, this is an example. So, the module 3 is actually a demonstration of how to develop multi-threaded network server. So, whatever server we develop in module 2, in module 3 we have actually made it as a multi-threaded server. And then of course, from Java 5 onwards there is another way of actually handling, but in that module 3 whatever demonstration is given, there is lot of multi-threading. The concurrency aspect which has been managed is actually managed, the entire thing is managed by the user itself, the one who is writing the server side. But then what we have is Java 5 onwards we have some more mechanism which is where the concurrency aspect is actually being handled independent of what is to be done, fine. So, we have APIs added in Java 5 called concurrency API. So, module 4 is actually using those kind of APIs and improving upon what was done in module 3. So, that is again multi-threaded concurrency is used. So, we have that module 4. Module 5, of course, I also mentioned that someone invoking a method on an object is also client server paradigm. So, we have this we have something like this, we have maybe we got because we mainly work on if we are using Java technology, we are more closer to the object oriented way of solving problems. So, when you design object oriented, you would design objects to be available, right. So, you design object and then we have in the object we have got methods, fine. So, now this module 5 which is about RMI. So, RMI is actually about how do we create objects on which method invocation can be done from a remote place. So, developing such kind of objects, fine. So, we would actually, so that is more about actually creating things which are creating those kind of Java, but this is RMI is actually a Java technology, but it would help you to create methods, fine. It would help you to create components for which method invocation can be done by any client from any place, fine. Such components can be created. So, that is what we will cover in module number 5. Module 6 is actually, because here we have RMI, we have got this server, fine. RMI also has some, it also offers us a mechanism whereby some component maybe as far as the modules are concerned, maybe the components which you develop, you may be having some requirement where interaction between client and server side, fine, the two sides may be needed, fine. So, for that purpose, fine, we have chosen one exercise which is about developing a chat server. So, we have module 6 which is developing the server side of the chat server. Okay. It demonstrates how we can develop a server side, a very simplistic chat server, fine. And we have module 7 which would actually be talking about developing the client side, the whole particular the client of a chat server application, creating the chat server, and we will be able to demonstrate how it works, fine. So, we can have a working chat server application there, fine. And then one of the very important things, another kind of a service which we always need. You may be following object oriented technology or whatever, but you have the requirements of persisting your data. You have lots of data and that needs to be saved, fine. And if you have objects, those objects need some persistence. So, for the purpose of persistence, one of the things which is very commonly used is the databases. So, we have the database services, fine. We have lots of databases, different kinds of databases can be there. What we have in Java is we have got a standard way of using the databases. The standardization which was even earlier available for programmers of C in the form of ODBC, fine. Same way, similar to that ODBC, for Java programmers we have got JDBC. So, we have got the JDBC APIs available as part of java.sql in the Java API. So, we have two modules there, fine, covering. So, module 8 and module 9 would cover about the JDBC APIs, fine. Then fine. So, they will talk about how to make a connection to a database in a standard way. So, any standard Java application should be able to make connection to any kind of database. Whatever would anyway be needed is the JDBC drivers must be available. And then we have this module for next modules will be the modules on understanding about the HTTP protocol. So, we have a module which just explains what exactly a HTTP protocol is, how HTTP, the formats of the HTTP protocol, the format of the request of the HTTP, format of the response of the HTTP, fine. So, we would understand that in the module number 10. So, module 10 is on understanding what we have as understanding the HTTP protocol, fine, about the exact formats what we have, fine. And then, so it is giving a good idea about how exactly the HTTP protocol works, the requirements which are available there. And then what we have is module number 11, which is actually about what is there in Java, in the Java APIs, how anyone can actually be a client to a HTTP server. So, it is actually about, so module 11 is actually about a HTTP client application. To develop a HTTP client, so, you know, in HTTP, when we say HTTP or even without even HTTP, there are other protocols also, fine, very popular protocols which allow us, which have things being resources. We have the concept of a resource. So, things are managed in terms of resource. You have a URL for the resource, and the URL is actually some kind of a giving us the resource is nothing but some point which gives us a content. So, how do we get a content for a given URL? Fine. So, becoming a client to download content from any kind of a server. Fine. So, we have that module 11 to actually demonstrate, to actually tell you how you can actually have a HTTP client side created, which normally is a task which is carried out by a browser, but maybe many times you may have a requirement even on a server application which you are writing, you may in turn like to go and connect to a different particular other server to fetch information. So, fetching content from any server if you have a URL, that is what we cover in the module 11. Fine. And then we have module 12 and 13. Okay. Module 12 and 13, they talk about applets. Module 12 is actually introducing you also to an important concept, the concept of a container. So, we have applet is one of the very first things which the applet is a very important, I will not say it is so important now, fine, but it used to be a very important component for in Java for the client side, for a web application. When now we have lot many other options, there are the other things which have replaced applets, fine, to give you almost the same effects. But now actually even maybe you have things which have been updated, applet may not work, but one thing, how the applet was working, the concept of applet which was there, the concept, the important concept which we are trying to introduce when we talk about applet and a life cycle is the concept of a container and a component, fine. We have seen that yes, applets are something which would work inside a browser. So, what exactly is a relation between the browser and the applet? The applet is being managed by the browser, fine, how the browser would be managing the exact kind of interactions which are there. The browser has to interact with the browser is actually on a client side, but the server component, the class file, the component of the server is actually managed, is being stored on the server side. So, it is actually being brought to the client's browser and working inside the browser of the client. So, how the interaction takes place between the applet and the browser. So, that aspect has been brought out, fine, and that is in module number 12, and module 13 is more about all the other rest of the APIs. So, module 12 would be talking on the life cycle because the component which is our applet here is managed within the container, the component managed in a container. So, the component would have a life cycle because the creation and all of those aspects of that component is actually done by a container. It is a browser who creates objects of applet and uses it as it interacts with it to let it know about things happening within the container. Okay. So, that is the life cycle of applet, and then we have the various things which the applet should then be able to interact with the browser and get help from the browser to do certain aspects, find certain. So, it is like the container is giving it some environment, making how that environment is made available to the component. So, I find the component interacting with container, container interacting with component. So, both aspects have been explained. So, that is the aspect why we have chosen to use have applet included in so module 12 and 13, fine. And then we have this module number 14, because yes, we are going to be following the Java technology. There are so many aspects in developing a distributed web distributed application, though we concentrate mainly on the web aspect, fine, web applications, but there are so many other things which are the requirements of any kind of an enterprise application. Enterprise applications are always distributed applications, fine, and therefore, what are the various components in what are the various kinds of components which are needed in an enterprise application. We have this Java Enterprise Edition. So, the specifications, everything here is in terms of specifications, fine. So, enterprise applications, the requirements, what are the various requirements of the enterprise application? There are common requirements of the enterprise application, and these requirements have nothing to do with actually the domain for which the application is developed. We have the common problems across all enterprise applications, and therefore, all enterprise applications need some infrastructure. So, you do not have to develop that infrastructure every time. That is where we have the concept of an application server, which is used for our applications, enterprise applications. So, enterprise applications would normally work on a application server. The developer does not create the infrastructure, he is not developing the whole thing, he develops the components, fine. Just like the applet was a component for the container. So, we have lots of different kinds of containers to solve different kinds of problems, fine, and you just need to be creating those different smaller components and just make configuration. It is more about configuring them on the server side. So, we have this module number 14 to give you the overview of all those things. We have the module, next module will be talking about a web application. We come to the web application. So, we have the concept of a web application, fine. What is there in a web application? Fine. We have there are the servlet specifications, fine, which are useful for a web application. So, we have a concept of a web application. The web application structure is there for if you are using a Java based components, fine. We have the web servlet specifications, and then in the servlet specifications there is a specific structure on how your web applications must be managed. You have some kind of a very good directory structure to manage all the components, all the resources rather, which are to be part of a web application. So, the definition of a web application, the structure of a web application, there is some XML file called web.xml, there is a deployment descriptor, what goes in the deployment descriptor, how it would be interpreted, fine, how that how the various things which are in the web.xml, how they are going to be interpreted by the container and used. All these aspects are being covered in your module number 15. Fine. We have module number 16, which is then talking about a specific, the very basic component in a servlet specification. It is the servlet component, fine. So, we go step by step here, fine. So, first we introduce just the interface, servlet interface, fine. We will say, which will talk about the life cycle of a servlet, fine. It talks in detail about the life cycle of a servlet, fine. What if the when you start, you are developing some components. So, the servlet is your web component, but when the servlet starts up, yes, it is going to be giving it is going to address a particular resource, it is going to address a particular URL. When it is, so what happens if when the servlet starts, it finds that in order to give the service, there are certain resources which it is dependent upon, and those resources are not yet up. Oh, even then what should it be doing? So, it is not that okay, you get down to the servlet and then servlet gives an error. The container could be informed about it, and container at its own level could take care of giving the proper responses to the client in case this particular servlet component is down, fine. So, how such things can be managed, fine. So, we have a detailing on the lifecycle methods, there are actually 3 lifecycle methods in a servlet. So, we have the detailing of all those 3 lifecycle methods of a servlet, that is done in module number 16. Fine. And then in the module 17, 18, we go on to look at the other components. See, servlet, what we have here is in our whole specification, servlet specifications, is we have components which the application developer would create. We have components which are going to be available to the to your application developer. Those components, see, as far as creation of the objects is concerned, it is going to be done entirely by the container, all objects managed by the container. But these are the objects which the application developer would create. So, we have only very few components which the application developer creates. Fine, he defines rather. Fine, he will define servlets, he will define the other components which will come to in subsequent modules. But what is going to be available to this particular servlet, he is going to be made available configuration information by using servlet config. He is going to be made available the interaction with the container, how does he interact with the container and know about the entire web application. He wants to use other components in a web application. So, he wants to dispatch his request somewhere. So, we have various kinds of components. So, it is a huge API. So, we have some basic API that is being covered in module number 17, and we have module 18 looking at some more components. Fine. So, we have those 2 modules 17 and 18 giving us mainly about what are there in the servlet API. Fine. The lot of things related to the servlet API. Fine. And then we have module number, after module 18 we have this module next modules, because this servlet specification is very general. It is actually divided into 2 parts, you can say. Fine. We have a very general part of a servlet module, fine, servlet specifications, which would be any protocol, fine. And for example, we even have servlets for SIP protocol also. It is not only HTTP protocol, though most commonly it would be the HTTP protocol. We will only concentrate on HTTP protocol, but we look at the 2 APIs. So, we first look at the API from generic point of view. So, there we have servlet, and we even talk about a class called generic servlet, and then later we have the next modules which are about the modules which are specific to HTTP. So, we have the next module which is HTTP specific API, how from a generic one specific to HTTP, fine, inheritance, how it is being used here, fine, understanding the entire API related to the HTTP. So, understanding the HTTP API, we have something like a HTTP servlet. We have earlier we have in the generic form we had only servlet and generic servlet, fine, but then we have HTTP servlet, fine, and here it uses HTTP servlet request, HTTP servlet response. Those are the kind of interfaces which we will come across when we look at HTTP specific API, fine. So, these are the HTTP specific components which any servlet specification will have to support, fine. You may be having some other servlet specification, you may be supporting other protocols, but this is something which is must, is always part of a servlet specification. So, any servlet container has to have this. So, we have the HTTP specific APIs being covered in fine, next module, and then we have the next few modules, which are about. So, next few modules are then moving on to things like cookies and sessions. So, we talk about cookies and sessions, fine, and then we have the other modules, the following modules we pick up after this. We have another kind of components, like it is not only the servlet component which the application developer creates. Application developer has certain requirements of using something like an interceptor whenever a request comes, intercepting it and doing something more. So, creating something like an interceptor. So, we have something called a filter. So, we have the next module which covers about filters, and then the subsequent module which would be talking about listeners. Listeners are nothing but, yes, we have something like a event dispatcher, event handlers. We have various events taking place happening within the container, within the web container a new request arrives, or even the start of an application. Well, I would like to do certain things whenever my application starts or whenever my application stops. So, we have details of those kind of components. We have something called various events, right. These are events happening. So, information about the event. So, we have those event classes. The classical event delegation model is being used here. So, we have the Java's classical event delegation model. This is the java.util.event object class. So, we have subclasses of those. We have listeners which extend from the event listener. So, all those things are there, and we have the listeners being discussed in the next module. And then after that, the next module after that would be covering about, then we switch to, so having covered all those things, then we look at, as far as the web is concerned, we move to the interface aspect. Fine. The web interface, when we want to give someone a web interface, a good web interface, we need to divide our job. Programmers would be good at processing part. Fine. They can do good backend processing, but designing, having a good design is something which we have as a separate role, which is a web page designer. Web page designer, he uses tags. Fine. So, we have something like that happening and available to us. So, you can go on and use more on tags. So, we have the next set of modules which talk on JSP, Java server pages. It is similar to, it is something which would normally be done, which would normally be the task not of a programmer, but would be the task of a web page design, would be the task of a web page designers. It is all going to be fine. So, then we had this, but yes, in this JSP we had actually Java code also entering into within the tags. So, we are normally a web page designer normally used to having all kinds of using the tags there. Fine, but then he with JSP he says within those tags you can embed the Java code. But he is not a Java programmer, he will not understand Java programming. But anyway, we cover those kinds of elements which go in a JSP, and then subsequently we move on to those things which are saying you do away with those kind of Java coding, do not do any Java coding. You even have we talk about directives, JSP directives, but then we also talk about what we call as the tags. There are those standard tags which are available for any web page designer. Fine. So, web page designer used to tags, and even using tags he can get rid of just by so he gets all the functionality which he would normally require in a JSP for having those use of the Java components which are going to be available in a JSP. So, these are things which are actually on this back end side only. JSPs are also working on the back end side, but it is a design which appears on the front end. It emits those HTML only. JSPs are only one kind of a servlet only, but yes, the one who writes JSP is actually a web page designer. So, we have tags, then after tags subsequently we even have something called even a programmer, if he wishes, he can create his own tags. So, we have the we have a module which explains about some programmer, if he wants to develop custom tags to make it available to a web page designer, how those custom tags can be created, how he can develop a library of those tags, and how those can be deployed. So, that is being covered in the subsequent modules. And once having seen those, that yes, we can have these kind of tags, any kind of tags can be developed, fine, custom tags. There are certain tag libraries. There is some project from Apache which was a development of a custom standard tag library, so called a JSTL. There was a project. So, we have that is something which is very commonly being used with JSP. So, a JSP developer, again it is all about tags only. So, we have tags for a standard set of tags, so that you do not keep on developing those very common requirements. So, we discuss those standard tags, the JSTL, and along with JSTL there is another thing, a very simplistic way of using objects within our JSP page, very simplistic way, and that is something which is known as an expression language or EL. So, we have JSTL and EL being covered in those subsequent modules, and having covered most of the components which go in a JSP. So, we have even one module in between which is related to talking about a architecture, which is a MVC architecture for developing web applications. So, we got some modules to show you how the different kinds of components can be managed, so that we have things being like, okay, the interface design should be in a JSP, web page designer does that job, but we have any interaction whenever it comes from a client, fine, we whenever there is an interaction, he is making some query, he has to go to a database. So, that is something which a programmer will be doing. So, we have servlets being doing there, we have controller, we have model classes, fine. So, dividing into MVC, fine, that is also important. And when we talked about JSP, JSP is actually part of is the view part of MVC model. So, we have model classes, we have which are nothing but model would be basic Java components. We discuss even module, there is also a module on Java beans to discuss about creating those basic very components of the model, fine, the kind of objects which need to be displayed, the kind of objects which would be created on the back end side, okay, entity objects, fine. And then we have, so we have this MVC model, and so JSP is basically we are just concentrating on the view aspect, fine. And then having seen all the things about JSP, another very important thing is security, fine. Security is important for any distributed application. So, we then subsequently have two modules, fine, which would be talking about the security. So, we have module which would talk about the security in general, understanding about what is a key pair, fine, what is a private public key, private key, what is meant by a certificate, what is a key store, fine, the tools used for managing a key store, fine, what is meant by signing something. Okay. So, a tool available in Java for signing the jar files, fine. When we use Java technology, we have lot of jar files where we have collection of most of them, the things are classes. So, how do we have someone endorsing them? So, we talk about the security in general, fine, and then we have another module which would talk about security in Java for a web application. In a web application is nothing but a set of resources, fine. So, we got lot of resources, and all those resources are available as URLs. It is a web application with just URLs. From the client point of view, he only knows URLs, everything for him is URLs. So, certain URLs need to be protected, and they have to be only available to authorized person. So, we have security for a web application. So, we have so that security for a web application, how authentication will be carried out. So, those things, how they can easily be done by using just some declarations in a deployment descriptor. So, that is being covered in our last module for web security, fine. So, that is how we go about in this particular paper, fine. So, fine, we will then in the next module we will start up with the networking. So, thank you. So, thank you. So, thank you. So, thank you. So, thank you.